a holiday terror warning. Security on high alert at St. Patrick's Cathedral here in New York and at churches all over the country. The FBI warning that ISIS is urging followers to strike houses of worship, targeting people as they flock to church to celebrate Christmas. ABC's Gloria Riviera has details.
Tonight, millions of Americans attending holiday services after that call from ISIS to attack churches. FBI and Homeland Security officials warning police to remain vigilant after ISIS published a link listing the names and addresses of churches across the U.S.
In light of what we've experienced in this country and the attacks that we've witnessed overseas, law enforcement has to take every situation seriously.
The list eliciting posts calling for even more violence as Christmas Sunday approaches. Attacks in coffee shops, hotels, and markets in the U.S., Canada, France, and the Netherlands.
That's something that we all have to consider and be safe and vigilant, but something that we're taking upon ourselves to be out and about and enjoy the holiday season with friends and family.
Officials say ISIS routinely uses lists like this one to encourage sympathizers to carry out lone wolf attacks, similar to the recent events in Berlin.
They're becoming inspired by these organizations, and they're willing to kill on their behalf.
In this latest bulletin, officials said they are not currently tracking a specific target, but there is concern this call from ISIS provides a dangerous motivation. Rebecca?
Thank you, Gloria. Now to a holiday terror warning. Federal authorities taking the move following ISIS calling for attacks on churches across America. ABC's Gloria Rivera has more from our Washington bureau, and good morning to you, Gloria.
Good morning, Rebecca. That's right. This new bulletin comes at a time of heightened vigilance around the world after the deadly attack in Berlin. The specifics here are deeply troubling as so many plan to attend religious services this Christmas Sunday. This morning, a new warning from the country's top counter-terror teams just as Christmas arrives. ISIS is calling for its supporters to target churches around the U.S. In a joint bulletin, FBI and Homeland Security officials are urging police to remain vigilant during this holiday season, after ISIS on December 21st published a link to a website containing the names and addresses of churches in the U.S. and called on supporters to attack them.
Even a person with no direct ties to a terrorist organization can still represent a threat to this country.
The bulletin says the link elicited posts that went further, urging ISIS sympathizers to carry out so-called aspirational attacks in markets, hotels, coffee shops, and more in the U.S., Canada, France, and the Netherlands, reminiscent of the recent Berlin attack. Authorities believe the Berlin assailant, Tunisian migrant Anis Amri, recorded this video praising the leader of ISIS just days before killing 12 people and injuring 48 more Monday when he drove a massive truck through the Christmas market in Berlin. Amri was killed in a shootout with police Friday morning in Milan after a manhunt stretching across Europe. Back here in the U.S., counter-terror officials say ISIS supporters have released similar lists in the past, but none have resulted in a successful attack. In this latest bulletin, officials said they are not tracking a specific target at this time. Dan?
Gloria, thank you.
Christians in Baghdad celebrated Christmas in a heightened state of fear after deadly attacks on Christian-owned shops that sell alcohol. Two shops next door to each other were riddled with bullets and blood after gunmen opened fire late Friday night. Police and medical sources said 3 people were killed and 4 wounded. The sale of alcohol is generally shunned among Iraq's Shiite and Sunni Muslims. Christian-run shops selling it were frequently targeted by militants from both sects during Iraq's year of sectarian civil war. Although the identities of the attackers who struck the stores are not known, the area where the attack occurred is predominantly Shiite.
On a more traditional note, Istanbul's Catholic community has celebrated Christmas with a midnight mass at one of the largest churches in the city. TRT World's Ali Mustafa reports.
A serene chorus fills the church of St. Anthony of Padova. It celebrates an ancient miracle, the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, 2,000 years ago.
Today I am celebrating God, the Lord of life and death, joining us as a human. Today I am celebrating the birth of my resurrection. Therefore neither death nor terror attacks can bother me.
For Christians, Jesus is the Son of God. Muslims revere Jesus as a Messiah who will return at the end of times. Praising Jesus' message of tolerance and acceptance, Turkish President Erdogan invoked Jesus, saying, "We, the members of this deep-rooted tradition, continue to embrace all the oppressed who have escaped war, oppression, and pressure." At the church, they offer prayers for the safety of loved ones and stand united in the face of hate and oppression.
Today, as Christians, we are celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ. As you can see, there are fewer people than last year because of the security problem in our country and because people are afraid. But we are still gathered here as believers to celebrate Jesus Christ's birthday.
They hail Christ, their Savior, and tie their own redemption to His. They repeat a spiritual tradition in one of Christianity's oldest cities. Ali Mustafa, TRT World, at the St. Anthony of Padova Church in Istanbul.
Head of the Catholic Church, Pope Francis, has called for an end to fighting in Syria, saying far too much blood has been shed in the war-torn country.
Peace be upon the men and women in Syria who have become martyrs, where too much blood has been spilled in the city of Aleppo, a theater of the most atrocious battle in the past weeks. It is time for weapons to be still forever and the international community to actively seek a negotiated solution.
In his Christmas address at the Vatican, Pope Francis urged people to remember the refugees and migrants and those who are living in crisis. He also appealed for a halt to Israeli aggressions against Palestinians. The pontiff then called for an end to fundamentalist terrorism in Nigeria, a reference to Boko Haram hostilities. The Syrian army has launched a fresh offensive to retake the Sul Wadi Barada area in northwestern Damascus from Western-backed militants. The government had initially offered militants from the Nusra Front to lay down their arms and leave the area via safe passage to Idlib province. The armed group, however, refused to leave. The militants have polluted Al-Fija spring in that area, which supplies water to Damascus and its suburbs. Much of the surrounding areas of Sul Wadi Barada are controlled by Syrian army troops.
Once again, battles rage in Aleppo as the Syrian Air Force carried out a series of airstrikes against rebel positions on the western outskirts of the city in retaliation to a rebel shelling that killed at least 6 civilians in the district of Saif al-Dawla. A Syrian military source tells CCTV that the ongoing airstrikes are not part of a large-scale military offensive, but are merely a deterrent. Syrian military units in Aleppo are still engaged in search and clearing operations in the recently retaken eastern districts of the city, and it seems the army will take some time before it can regroup and embark in a new attack against rebel positions in the countryside of Aleppo. Sources close to the Syrian government say that rebel attacks aim to prevent the government from savoring its victory in Aleppo, adding that Damascus will do whatever it takes to solidify its positions in the city that was the country's largest prior to the beginning of the conflict. Meanwhile, residents of Aleppo fear that repeated rocket attacks by the rebels could send the city in another endless cycle of violence, after many of them hoped that war was over for Aleppo. Ala Ibrahim, CCTV, Damascus.
Now, the Syrian capital is suffering a third consecutive day of water shortages after foreign-backed militants polluted the water resources there. The government cut off water to Damascus on Friday after terrorist attacks on all water resources feeding into the city and its surroundings. It said the militants have contaminated the water resources into Damascus with pollutants and diesel. Authorities said that they'll use reserves and pump water to various city neighborhoods according to a rationing schedule. An estimated 1.5 million people live inside Damascus, with another 3.5 million living in its suburbs. Now joining us out of Damascus for an update is our own Press TV's Mohammed Ali. Hello there, Mohammed. Thanks for joining us on the program. Now, what more can you tell us about these terrorist contamination of the water resources there? And Mohammed, do we know how many neighborhoods and people are actually being affected?
Yes, those affected are the entire areas and quarters of Damascus and its countryside, because the terrorists who are positioned in Wadi Barada Valley in the northwestern countryside of Damascus poisoned the drinking water that feeds Damascus and its countryside, which is called Naba al-Fije spring over there, by adding fuel or diesel into such a spring, and the water now cannot be used by the residents of Damascus and its countryside. Now, this is not the first time that the terrorists attack water that feeds Damascus and its countryside. This is the third time that happens during the unrest. The reason behind such an act by terrorists is that, of course, we know that the Syrian army on Friday, just 2 days ago, started a military operation against the Al-Nusra Front in some of the villages that are in the western and northwestern countryside of Damascus, which are Bassime and Al-Husayniya, because those terrorists refused to get out in accordance with a deal with the Syrian government. Thus, the Syrian government, and the Syrian army, which is determined to secure the perimeter of the capital, decided thus to attack those terrorists and end the threats that they pose around Damascus. And because of the Syrian army military operation here in the northwestern countryside, terrorists, in response, poisoned the water that feeds Damascus and its countryside. This is not a surprise. However, at the end of the day, as usual, civilians are the ones suffering the most, the residents of Damascus and its countryside, not the government and not the Syrian army.
And Mohammed, do we know if they're attacking a water resources plant, or are they catching it earlier in a natural spring river? Do we have any idea where this attack is taking place?
Yes, this attack is taking place in Barada Valley. This is where that water runs from. It's a spring. They are putting fuel and gasoline or diesel where the water runs in that river towards Damascus and its countryside. The Syrian government cut the water resources directly in order for the residents not to use that water anymore without knowing that it is poisoned, and started actually giving and providing water, of course, using other resources. This is what the Syrian government has been doing. However, there is shortage, because at the end of the day, there is not enough water if such a spring is not being used. This is the main water resource for Damascus and its countryside.
Well, thank you, Mohammed. It's very unfortunate. We know millions of people are being affected. It's very daunting for the government to be able to provide all those families with enough adequate water. Thank you. As our own Press TV's Mohammed Ali giving us his update out of Damascus.
News appeared this month in a website called AWD News, which is famous or infamous for spreading conspiracy theories. And the news article in question stated that, quoted Moshe Yaalon, the former Israeli defense minister, as saying that if Pakistan sends troops to Syria, Israel can launch a nuclear strike. Now, Pakistan never committed to sending troops into northern Syria to fight against ISIS, and Yaalon did not make those comments. Because Israel is viewed as an enemy in Pakistan, a lot of the news that circulates isn't necessarily true. And this is not just on global fake news websites, but local websites and newspapers also issue conspiracy theories specifically about Israel. They use it for political gains, as Khwaja Asif might have wanted to do in this instance, but there is no clarification on why he tweeted a fake news to begin with.
On Saturday, Israel's Prime Minister lashed out at U.S. President Barack Obama, accusing him of an ambush in the UN over West Bank settlements. Benjamin Netanyahu added in a statement that he is now looking forward to working with President-elect Donald Trump. The comments came a day after the U.S. allowed the UN Secretary Council to condemn Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, calling them a, quote, flagrant violation of international law. The president-elect himself also condemned the UN vote on Saturday, saying on Twitter that it will make it much harder to negotiate peace.
It comes after the United Nations Security Council adopted a resolution demanding Israel stop settlement building within occupied Palestinian territory. There were also harsh words for the Obama administration from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who claimed that Washington had conspired with the Palestinians to push for the resolution's adoption. Netanyahu says his country will reassess its relationship with the United Nations.
I instructed the Foreign Ministry to complete within a month a new evaluation of all our relations with the UN, including the Israeli funding of UN institutions and the presence of UN representatives in Israel.
Netanyahu says he has already instructed his government to stop about 30 million shekels, or nearly $8 million in funding to 5 UN institutions that are, in his words, especially hostile to Israel. The Prime Minister warned of more such measures to come. The resolution passed the 15-member Security Council after the United Nations declined to use its power of veto, a move Netanyahu called shameful. As a long-standing ally of Israel, Washington has shielded the Jewish nation from many similar resolutions in the past. For decades, Israel has been building Jewish settlements on territory that it seized from its Arab neighbors in a 1967 war. This area included the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Most countries view these settlement activities as illegal and an obstacle to peace, but Israel disagrees, saying that it has an ancient connection to the land.
Now, major magnitude 7.6 earthquake struck off the coast of southern Chile on Sunday, prompting the evacuation of coastal areas on the island of Chiloé. No fatalities or major damage to infrastructure has been reported in the tourist-heavy region. And the earthquake disrupted Christmas celebration plans for thousands of people who were forced to flee their homes and seek higher ground amid warnings of a potential tsunami. Later, however, Chile's National Emergency Office lifted the tsunami warning, signaling to the nearly 5,000 people that they could safely return to their homes. An extent of the damage left to one bridge collapsed and more than 20,000 homes without power.
Well, the authorities continue to evacuate residents that are being affected. Now, the storm is bringing much more wind more than rain. So the problems of flooding is a little bit minimal. But the strongest problem right now in the region, we receive reports, is that very, very strong winds and gustiness. And this is affecting a lot of the power lines and even the communications lines. Now, those that have been evacuated since yesterday, or Friday and Saturday, they are being given food, they're being given blankets and all of that needed material, and being secured from the very, very strong winds and the rain. Right now we receive reports that visibility in the area is virtually near zero, and but forces are still in the area. Relief and disaster rescue teams are in the area, scouring the area if there are any other residents still not in the evacuation centers.
Now, Kuitun, a city in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, has seen the heaviest snow of winter. About 20 centimeters of snow fell for more than 20 hours from the middle of the day on Friday to Saturday evening. The snow is causing heavy traffic and disruptions daily life. Heating and the power supply services were working around the clock to keep people warm.